There is a secret island I have been going to for over 40 years that is my idea of paradise. I can get there by either riding my bicycle for 45 minutes, then taking the ferry, or I could paddle my kayak from my apartment in an hour and a half. The island is the largest urban car-free community in North America. Less than a mile away, you'll find this. There are 6 million people that live within 20 miles of this place, yet almost no one knows about it. You can see from the following videos taken during the spring, summer, and fall that there are very few people around other than the locals. I guess everyone's either working, twittering, or watching the big game on TV. That's why I call it the Secret Island. What I love about this place is that it's a self-contained community, a haven far from the madding crowd. The streets are just sidewalks, and everyone gets around by walking or pedaling. Most of the houses are over 100 years old. Every home is unique, reflecting the spirit of the people who live there. There are no rules and bylaws to tell them what they can grow in their gardens, or how high the grass is allowed to grow, or what color you can paint your house. There's also no police, and no crime. There is a fire department, a school and school buses for the older kids, and even school buses for the nursery school kids. There's a church, lots of playgrounds, and an artist's retreat. There's a beach where you can swim and watch the sailboats on the lake, a tennis court, a baseball diamond, and cafes with outdoor patios. I like to sit and listen to the sounds of the village, the laughter of children playing, housewives talking over the back fence, someone playing the piano, a happy dog barking, the crickets and the birds, the wind in the willows, and the waves on the shore. And everywhere there are flowers. This might not be your idea of paradise, but this is the type of community I wish I grew up in. I wish I could have raised a family in. I wish I could have played with my grandchildren in. That would have been paradise. But I never had that, and most of you watching have never had it either, because it was stolen from us. For just the money that was spent on war in the last 10 years, the U.S. government could have built a home like one of these, in a community like this, for every family in America. Don't believe me? Do the math at the end of this video for yourself. They stole not just your money, but your productivity, the most productive people in the world. And instead of building a humane society, what they didn't keep for themselves, they spent on this. And here's the kicker. The money you pay on just the interest on the money stolen from you would have allowed you a 2-month paid vacation every year. Imagine taking every summer off to stay home and raise your family, to teach your kids how to play ball, how to swim, how to paddle a canoe, taking them out for an ice cream sundae at the cafe, having neighbors you can trust to babysit while you take your spouse out for dinner, and a romantic walk along the boardwalk. But all that was stolen from you by 100 or so psychopathic monsters whose hatred for humanity burns so hot that not even your unending suffering and misery can quench their thirst for destruction. If left unchecked, they will end up destroying all life on the planet. That's what psychopaths do. That's what they always do. If we stop spending money on pointless wars now, the money we save could build human communities and businesses all over our country, and we could do it in 5 years. Don't show this video to your children or grandchildren, because what will you say when they ask you how you let them steal paradise from you, your future, their future, to produce nothing but death and destruction? What will you say when they ask you, why didn't you try to stop the bad men, Daddy? In my short video, Paradise Stolen, I made the claim that for the money, your money, spent in the past 10 years on war, the government could have built a small home on a small plot of land in a small community for every family in America. I used this as an analogy of what could be purchased for the money spent on illegal and immoral wars. I'm not saying that the government should build homes for every family in America. But then again, if you are determined to piss away $6 trillion anyways, then why not spend it on a utopian dream that might benefit Americans? Could the outcome be worse than causing the gruesome death and destruction of millions of people? The arguments against such a proposal were what I expected. One argument claims that we are dreaming of an unworkable utopia, and that way of living is inefficient, impractical, and not cost-effective. But these arguments are baseless and the result of lies and propaganda. We were lied to convince us that the insanity of our current economic system is the only system that could work to keep us from living like free human beings instead of cattle on a giant tax farm. So allow me to dispel the myth that it is inefficient and impractical to live decent lives in decent communities. I'll take just one out of hundreds of possible examples I could have chosen from. This is a small town in the north. Their one and only industry is logging. They cut down the logs and load them onto trucks. The trucks drive hundreds of miles and load the logs onto trains. The trains travel hundreds of miles where the logs are loaded onto ships. The ships sail thousands of miles where the logs are loaded onto trucks. The trucks drive hundreds of miles where the logs are unloaded at a sawmill. The sawmill cuts the logs into lumber where it is loaded onto trucks that drive hundreds of miles to a manufacturing plant. The manufacturing plant turns the lumber into cutting boards. The cutting boards are loaded onto trucks. The trucks travel hundreds of miles where they are loaded onto ships. The ships travel thousands of miles where the boards are loaded onto trucks. The trucks drive hundreds of miles to be unloaded at a warehouse. They are then put on trucks again where they are delivered to retail stores. So, when the lumberjack comes home from work, he finds his wife slicing bread on a cutting board that was made in China. Does anyone in their right mind think this is somehow efficient? And what about the so-called carbon footprint of shipping crap back and forth over the entire planet? But you, they're going to tax because you breathe too much. We are told that the low wages in China make this whole system profitable. I have my doubts. The Chinese are and have always been some of the most exploited people in the world. Factory workers typically work 12 to 16-hour shifts, 7 days a week, with 1 day off a month and 1 week off a year to visit their families. They are packed like sardines into company dorms, and many rely on methamphetamine to get through their shifts. They have suicide prevention nets around their factories, for God's sake. This system destroys jobs here, destroys lives in China, and destroys the environment the world over. And what happens when there are no more jobs here? Who is going to be able to afford bread, let alone a cutting board from China? The only thing this system is efficient at is making obscene profits for a few psychopaths before the whole system collapses and takes us all down with it. So, what's the alternative? How about we don't ship the logs to China, but instead build a sawmill in this town? And not just a sawmill, but a paper factory, a furniture manufacturer, a log cabin kit builder, craftsman workshops, and artist studios. These provide decent jobs and wages which will support many other small businesses like shops and restaurants and theaters. And to make this sustainable, we don't just clear-cut a forest, but harvest only a percentage while planting tree farms and something like hemp fields, so that the reduced production of trees is offset by another industry manufacturing rope and linen and thousands of other products that can be made from hemp. And the products can be transported on a light electric rail line to a distribution hub that links the country together and bypass that side trip to China. I can't give a solution to all the possible arguments to this idea in a short video, but once you start to think along these lines, you will find solutions on your own. But don't take my word for it. There is actually a historical example of how such a sustainable system really worked for a while, and that place is America in the 1700s, until the bankers arrived. In my short video, Paradise Stolen, I used the analogy that for the money spent on the war in the past 10 years, we could have built a small home on a small plot of land in a small community for every family in America. A common argument against this idea is that there just isn't enough room in all of America to provide people with decent homes in decent communities. But this argument is baseless and the result of lies and propaganda. We were lied to convince us that there's so many people that we have to cram everyone into high-density housing in high-density cities because there's not enough room on the planet. So let's dispose of this myth, the myth of overpopulation. The community portrayed in the video consists of 262 homes, but for our purposes, we'll round it off to 250 homes. If we assume an average of 3 people per family, or 1 home for every 3 people, that would mean about 750 people live there. Including parks and playgrounds, the whole community sits on 12 acres of land. Now let's take the U.S. population of 320 million and divide them into communities of 750 people each, which gives us 426,666 villages. Each village sits on 12 acres, so multiply that by 12, equals 5,119,992 acres. Convert acres to square miles and we have just under 8,000 square miles. That means we could fit everyone in America in a 1-story home with a front yard and a backyard, with plenty of parks and playgrounds and waterways for every 750 people, and it would all fit easily on the available landmass of the state of New Hampshire, and still have 1,000 square miles to spare. That could leave the entire rest of the country, including Alaska, without a single person living there. See now how ridiculous it is to think that the entire landmass of the U.S. cannot provide the needs and resources for a low-density population taking up less room than New Hampshire. But let's go further. Let's take the entire population of the planet, 7.3 billion people. We do the same math. 7.3 billion divided by 750 times 12 acres converted to square miles, and we have 180,000 square miles. That means we could fit everyone in the world Every American, Canadian, Australian, Mexican, European, Russian, Muslim, African, Hindu, Chinese, Japanese, Indonesian, and all of South America, in a one-story home with a front yard and a backyard with plenty of parks and playgrounds and waterways for every 750 people, and the entire world population could all fit easily on less than 75% of the available landmass of the state of Texas, and still have 80,000 square miles of Texas to spare. I think we can all agree there are too many people in the world, and we really should limit our reproduction. But too many people is not the reason that half the population of the world has to live in hunger and squalor, and the rest of us lives of desperation and alienation. So, why are we being herded into these high-density megacities? We've already shown that it's not efficient, and we know that there's plenty of room for everyone. Well, the answer is that a few dozen psychopaths want us to tear each other to pieces so that we won't unite against our slave masters. We are part of a giant laboratory experiment, and each of us is just an expendable little white lab mouse. Don't believe me? Well, don't take my word for it. Let's go back 50 years and take a look at some experiments by a Dr. John Calhoun called Mouse Utopia.
The work of Dr. John Calhoun at the National Institute of Health in Washington, D.C. has attempted to answer this question. In a unique experiment that took years to complete, Dr. Calhoun used white mice to study population growth and its effects on individual behavior. In this 16-cell mouse habitat, utopian conditions of nutrition, comfort, and housing were provided for a potential population of over 3,000 mice. Yet, in spite of ideal conditions, the mouse population met with catastrophe. The population of the mice doubled every 60 days. This was called the exploit period. The third period, consisting of 300 days, found the population of mice leveling off. This was called the equilibrium period. Dr. Calhoun noticed that the newer generations of young were inhibited, since most space was already socially defined. At this time, some unusual behavior became noticeable. Violence became prevalent. Excess males strived for acceptance, were rejected, and withdrew. Huddling together, they would exhibit brief flurries of violence among themselves. Other young mice growing into adulthood exhibited an even different type of behavior. Dr. Calhoun called these individuals the beautiful ones. Their time was devoted solely to grooming, eating, and sleeping. They never involved themselves with others, engaged in sex, nor would they fight. All appeared as a beautiful exhibit of the species, with keen, alert eyes and a healthy, well-kept body. These mice, however, could not cope with unusual stimuli. Though they looked inquisitive, they were, in fact, very stupid. Dr. Calhoun called the last period the die phase, leading the population into extinction. Although the mouse utopia could house 3,000, the population began to decline at 2,200. In the shift from the equilibrium to the die phase, each animal became less aware of associates, despite all animals being pushed closer together. Dr. Calhoun concluded that the mice could not effectively deal with the repeated contact of so many individuals. The evidence of violence increased to the point where most individuals had had their tails bitten to some degree. Eventually, the entire mouse population perished.
What the filmmakers fail to mention is that these mice would never have behaved that way if they weren't trapped in the narrow confines of the experiment. These behaviors and conditions would never exist in nature. It is only an artificial, closed system that causes these problems. Still wonder why we are being herded into cities? In my video, Paradise Stolen, I made the claim that with the money spent fighting wars, America could have created a paradise. The reason the government gives for stealing $6 trillion of your hard-earned money is that they are just trying to keep you safe from terrorism. This argument is a lie for numerous reasons, but I'll only cover a couple of them. The first reason is saving lives. The number one cause of death in the U.S. is heart disease. You are 17,600 times more likely to die from heart disease than from a terrorist attack. If the government were to deal with this threat proportionate to the manner in which it deals with the threat of terrorism, then they would be nuking McDonald's franchises all over the world. You are also more than 8 times more likely to be shot by your local police than killed by terrorists. Yet, you don't see drone strikes on police stations. The fact is that the threat of dying from a terrorist attack is so low on the statistical scale that it's hardly on the scale at all. So we can safely put aside the myth that spending $6 trillion to murder Muslims around the world has anything to do with protecting American lives. This leaves us the justification of fighting terrorism because they are violating the human rights of people in third world countries. This is again another lie. It has been well documented in hundreds of mainstream and alternative journalistic articles and books that every third world despot and tyrant in the past 100 years has been installed and supported by the Western powers, especially the U.S. If America really wanted to stop human rights abuses around the world, then they would be black-bagging and hauling off to Guantanamo the heads of every major bank and multinational corporation in the country, since they are the ultimate source behind the abuse and exploitation of most of the world's populations. But let's cut to the chase. The prima facie case for the war on terrorism is the events of September 11th, 2001. 9/11 has been the excuse to launch wars, militarize the police, eliminate human rights, destroy the Constitution, justify kidnapping and torture, and carry out the full spectrum of spying and surveillance of the common citizen. And as we all know, 9/11 was an inside job. You know it, I know it, every political leader in the world knows it, and everyone on the planet with an IQ above 70 knows it. The truth is that the war on terror is actually a war on humanity, waged by a small group of diabolical interspecies predators. And you are forced, at the barrel of a gun, to pay for it all. The reason they get away with it is because most people are under the delusion that if they work hard, pay their taxes, keep their heads down, and never ask any uncomfortable questions, that the monsters will leave them alone. Well, history shatters this idea. People who stand up to the monsters will likely get a bullet in the head. But those that grovel are even more despised by the psychopaths. They don't get a bullet to the head. No, their deaths will be drawn out, slow and painful. They are worked until the stress and toxic environment in which they live causes horrific and painful diseases, where endless surgeries and poisonous medications, the literal death of 1,000 cuts, ensures that their last days on earth will be as miserable as possible, while their families suffer in anguish and are left with only a financial catastrophe. Modern humans, with our knowledge and technology, could have easily created a paradise, and instead we allowed ourselves to descend into hell on earth because we continue to believe in an ancient evil, the evil of empire. We live in the richest country in the world. But when you take a look around you, you see hardship, poverty, homelessness, crime, corruption, alcoholism, addiction, broken homes and families. Everybody worries about money, day and night, how to make more, how to spend less. How is it possible for so much poverty to exist in a country with so many riches? To answer that question, you have to follow the money. I'm going to use the same example I used in my video, The Myth of Efficiency, and retrace the route from raw lumber to finished product, a cutting board, to show you where all the money went. This is a lumberjack. He cuts trees to sell to sawmills. The lumberjack has to pay a lot of taxes. There's tax on the equipment he buys, tax on the gas he uses, tax on the licenses he needs, tax on the cutting permits, tax on the insurance he's required to buy, and when the lumberjack gets his paycheck, he has to pay tax on that too. Now, the lumberjack couldn't hope to stay in business if he paid all those taxes himself. So he has to include a proportion of the tax expense into the final selling price of his logs. That's part of the cost of doing business. This cost is called a hidden tax or embedded tax. The lumberjack has to get his lumber to the sawmill, so he hires a transport company. The transport company has a lot of taxes to pay. There's taxes on the equipment he buys, tax on the garage he stores his equipment in, tax on the gas he uses, tax on the licenses he needs, tax on the transport permits, tax on the insurance he's required to buy, and when the truck driver gets his paycheck, he has to pay tax on that too. Now, the trucker couldn't hope to stay in business if he just paid all those taxes himself. So he has to include a proportion of the tax expense into the final cost of transporting the lumberjack's logs. The lumberjack has to include the costs of shipping, including a proportion of the shipper's taxes in his selling price. So the lumberjack is paying a tax on tax. When the sawmill buys the lumber, they are paying taxes on taxes on taxes. But the sawmill has a lot of taxes to pay too. All of these taxes are likewise included into the price of finished lumber. The sawmill has to hire a transport company to haul the lumber to the manufacturer, and so must pay a proportional amount of that shipper's taxes as well. When the manufacturer buys the lumber, he's already paying taxes on taxes on taxes on taxes. But the manufacturer has a lot of direct taxes to pay too, which he includes into the price of his cutting boards. Now, the manufacturer has to hire a transport company to ship his cutting boards to the distribution warehouse. And of course, he has to pay a proportional amount of the shipper's taxes as well. I know, this is getting repetitive, so let's skip ahead. The manufacturer sells the finished product to the wholesaler, who sells to a retailer, who sells to the housewife. During each exchange from raw lumber to finished product to all shipping and storing in between, the cost increases to pay the taxes each party is responsible for. But wait, it gets worse. All those taxes don't just pay themselves. All the lumberjacks truck drivers, manufacturers, wholesalers, and retailers have to spend dozens, if not hundreds of hours filling in forms, writing applications, arranging for inspections, filing receipts, and then hiring bookkeepers and accountants. The bookkeepers and accountants have a lot of taxes to pay, and so, well, you get the idea. The time and money spent paying taxes and complying with regulations is called the cost of compliance and accounts for about 12% of a business's operating expenses. These costs are likewise passed on to the consumer. Not even teams of forensic accountants can figure out what percentage of the cost of goods and services are directly due to hidden taxes, but by the most conservative estimates, it is at least 25%. By the time you purchase a product, you are paying a portion of dozens of taxes on taxes, and even paying taxes on the cost of paying taxes. But wait, it gets worse. The housewife who buys the cutting board has a lot of taxes to pay too. A middle-class taxpayer has to pay on average 25% federal income tax. Then there's the federal Social Security and Medicare payroll tax of 13.3%. 5.65% of that is removed from the employee's paycheck, and the remaining 7.65% is supposed to be paid by the employer. But in reality, you pay the entire 13.3% because employers simply pay you 7.65% less to cover their costs. And then there are state taxes, which averages at 4.82% for the middle-class taxpayer, which brings the total to 43.12% in federal and state taxes. And it's going higher every year. So let's add it all up. For the $10 that a housewife spends to buy a cutting board, we first take away 43.12% for state and federal taxes. Then deduct 25% for the embedded taxes. Oh, and don't forget sales tax, anywhere between 5 to 15%, but let's average it out to 10%. That brings us to a grand total of 78% of every dollar earned and spent going to taxes. That means if the housewife paid $10 for the cutting board, then $7.80 went to the government. That leaves $2.20 to pay the lumberjacks, the truck drivers, sawmill employees, manufacturers and their employees, the shippers and receivers and the forklift drivers, and even the sales clerks at the shopping center. All have to live on that $2.20 while the government takes the rest. Let's look at this another way. Every day for the first 10 months of the year, you get up early in the morning, spend an hour or two in rush hour traffic, put in 8 to 12 hours at work, drive home through rush hour traffic, and every penny you earn goes to the government. That leaves you 2 months of every year to earn enough money to pay all your bills, housing, food, transportation, clothes for the kids, prescription drugs, and everything else you need for a whole year. So, the reason we are poor is not because of slumping stock markets or international trade or high cost of salaries or because you are lazy. No, the reason is that our governments and the banks that own them have stolen at least 80% of our lives and livelihoods. But wait, it gets worse. Despite robbing us at a rate the sheriff of Nottingham could never have dreamed of, our governments have still managed to run up a debt into the untold trillions of dollars. Guess who has to pay that back? Those dirt-poor medieval peasants that Robin Hood tried to protect from the ravenous tax collectors of evil King John finally rebelled and forced the king to sign the first declaration of civil rights in history, the Magna Carta. the inspiration for the Constitution. So, what was the tax rate raised to that caused the whole of England to rise up in rebellion? 15%. And they still got 2 months off a year. We are worse off than peasants, and cunningly brainwashed to believe it's all our fault. But wait, it gets worse. In my last video, I showed how governments and the psychopathic bankers that own them rob us of 80% of all the money we earn. Money that, if we were allowed to keep, could have gone to creating a paradise on earth for everyone, despite exploiting their citizens on a scale never before seen in history. The state was still not satisfied and has been stealing even more money from us while we were sleeping. To illustrate how they have done this, I'd like to take you back 55 years to my first job. I was 6 years old, and on Saturdays I was hired by the kindly old widow Robertson to weed the dandelions from her front yard. For 2 hours' work, she would pay me 50 cents. Now, working for 25 cents an hour may not seem like a lot of money, but for a kid in 1963, it was a small fortune. After washing up and wolfing down a PB&J sandwich and a glass of milk, I would take my newfound wealth and head to the corner variety store. There, I could choose from dozens of items to purchase. I could buy 5 10-cent chocolate bars, or 5 10-cent ice cream cones, or 5 10-cent bottles of pop, or any combination of sweets and toys. I learned to diversify my investments, and typically I would buy a chocolate bar, an ice cream cone, a rubber band-powered balsa wood airplane, a ray gun-style water pistol, 5 cents worth of Bazooka Joe bubblegum, and 5 cents worth of red licorice strings. Fast forward to the present day, and what can you buy today with 50 cents? Not one chocolate bar, not one soda pop, not one toy. To purchase those items today that I purchased when I was a kid would cost at least $5. That means the purchasing power of our money, the value of our money, has declined by 90% in 55 years. This is called inflation and is the result of a fiat money system administered by central banks that steal another 5% of our earnings by paying us with money that has already lost value before we even cash the check. Our governments ensure we are paid with toy money, but the tens of thousands of hours we spend working our asses off is very real. And here's the proof and the twist ending to this story. Old Widow Robertson paid me with a 1963 silver $50. Those coins still contained 80% silver, and as of the date of this video, the silver melt value of that coin is about $5. In 55 years, it has not lost a single percent of its value or purchasing power. The reason is that silver and gold is and has always been real money. That's why they no longer mint coins with silver, because there would be no way for the banks to steal the value of your money after you received it. So now, we have billions of people working their lives away, enslaved to the almighty dollar. And when it crashes, as it always does, we will lose everything, and it will have all been for nothing.